The following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome our other good friend, Seth Pinsky, who will be making a presentation on a stronger, more resilient New York. Seth is the president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation and director of the Mayor's Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome EDC President and Director of the Mayor's Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, Seth Pinsky.
Now, some of you may think it's strange for a mayor in the last year of his term in office to launch a long-term effort to tackle a global problem. But as the mayor, to his credit, realized, though Sandy is first and foremost a tragedy, and we can't lose sight of that, it also presented New York City with an opportunity to build on the substantial sustainability and resiliency progress that we've made since the launch of Plan YC in 2007, and an opportunity to focus the attention of New Yorkers on the threat of climate change, the threat that the mayor himself said may be the defining threat of our era. This morning, what I want to do is walk you through the genesis of our plan and our findings. And I think if you know me or you've read our plan, you won't be surprised that this discussion may be a little bit heavy on analysis and statistics, but I think that it's really important in order to understand why we've developed the answers that we developed, for you first to understand what the questions were that we were trying to answer. So let's turn to the plan. And let's start where the plan started, which was in December of last year. And that's when Mayor Bloomberg created the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency and asked us to answer 3 questions for him. First, he wanted us to answer the question of what happened during Sandy and why, and not on an anecdotal level, but on a really analytical level. Second, he wanted us to answer what could happen in the future given what could come from climate change. And third, the question that we all probably care most about, the so what question. So what do we do about it? To answer this, we pulled together a team that ultimately numbered over 35 full-time professionals. Several of them are actually sitting here in the room today, and I wanted to thank them for all of their hard work on this, who came from a variety of backgrounds. And we worked with experts from government, from academia, from the private, and from the not-for-profit sectors. In addition to working with these experts, another key element of the special initiative was working with, the public and elected officials. As you can see, we worked with the offices of over 65 elected officials. We met with nearly 20 community boards. We regularly consulted with over 300 community-based organizations. We held public workshops across the 5 boroughs that over 1,000 ordinary New Yorkers attended. And these conversations were very important to us for a couple of reasons. First, they gave us the opportunity to bounce our ideas off of New Yorkers and to hear their reactions to them. But as importantly, they also gave us an opportunity to listen. And some of the best ideas that we have in our plan came from exactly those discussions. So what did we learn? And let's start with the first question: what happened during Sandy and why? And I think that what won't be surprising to anyone who lived through Sandy is the fact that Sandy is really a story not of wind, not of rain, but of storm surge. And to illustrate this, I would ask you to look at the chart that you see on the screen, which shows the 10 highest high water marks here at the Battery since 1900. And what you'll notice is 2 things on this chart. First, what you'll notice is that all 10 of the 10 highest high water marks since 1900 have occurred since 1950. And second, what you'll notice is that Hurricane Sandy literally eclipsed the previous record, which was set in 1960 with Hurricane Donna, by more than 40%. And that begs the question, why? And the answer to that is that there was a confluence of idiosyncratic factors that all came together in exactly the wrong way for New York City. So, for example, there was the size of Hurricane Sandy. What you see on this chart on the left side is an image of Hurricane Katrina as it approached the Gulf Coast. What you see on the right side is an image of Hurricane Sandy as it approached the New Jersey coast. And what you'll notice is that Hurricane Sandy was over 3 times the size of Hurricane Katrina. Another key factor was the very quirky path that Hurricane Sandy followed. Now, as most of you know, when hurricanes track up the East Coast, almost all of the time, they head in a generally north-northeasterly direction and eventually head out to sea. That was not the case for Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy instead took this distinctive leftward turn. And in fact, had Hurricane Sandy not been downgraded just before it hit the shore to a post-tropical cyclone, it would have only been the 3rd hurricane to have hit the New Jersey coast since 1878. Yet another factor that was critical in determining the impact of Hurricane Sandy was its specific timing, the specific timing of its arrival. And I think this chart illustrates that nicely. Here again, we're back at the Battery, and this is showing the water levels at the Battery over time as Sandy approached. And in order to understand this, if you look at the light blue lines, what that shows is the normal tidal cycle here at the Battery. The green line represents Sandy's surge excluding the impact of the tide, and the red line represents the sum of the blue and the green lines, or what actually happened. And as you can see from this chart, the green line, the surge, peaked at almost the exact instant of high tide here in the harbor. And that resulted in the peak surge of nearly 14 feet at the Battery with all of the attendant damage that came with it. Now, to illustrate the important role played by timing, I want to show you a counterfactual. So this is what actually happened during Sandy along the coasts of northern Queens and the South Bronx. And just so you understand, this is an area that is on a different tidal cycle than the harbor and the ocean. As you can see, during Sandy, though, parts of LaGuardia Airport flooded significantly and parts of College Point flooded significantly. Much of the area escaped largely unharmed. However, if Sandy had hit just 9 hours earlier during high tide in this area, the results would have been as shown here. You would have had severe flooding in College Point. You would have had parts of LaGuardia Airport under more than 12 feet of water. You would have had significant flooding in Hunts Point, which is the source of much of our fresh fruits and vegetables. And you would have had significant flooding in Astoria, where over 1/3 of the in-city power generation for New York can be found. 10 o'clock, as the surge was starting to peak, the wind suddenly shifted, and instead we're coming out of the southeast and heading towards the northwest. And that had 2 effects. First, it whipped up the destructive waves that came with the surge. And second, it literally drove the waters of Sandy into the southern extremities of the city, into areas like the east and south shores of Staten Island, Coney Island, and the Rockaways. And the result of all this was the pattern of damage with which all of us are familiar. The chart here shows in yellow and red dots the buildings that were tagged yellow and red. They had significant damage, according to the Department of Buildings. And what you can see is that in the harbor, which was largely sheltered from the destructive waves that came with Sandy, there was a significant amount of still water inundation, large volumes of water, which caused a lot of damage to building systems, but less structural damage. By contrast, along the coast, you can see that there not only was that still water inundation, but also that significant wave action, which led to the destruction that we saw in many of these neighborhoods. What we should learn from Sandy is 2 things. First, Sandy devastated many New Yorkers, and we have a moral duty to those New Yorkers to help them to rebuild and repair their lives. But second, even if Sandy may not be precisely repeated in the future, it needs to serve as a harbinger of a type of risk that we in New York face and for which we must prepare. And I think that provides a nice segue into the second question that the mayor asked us to answer, which is, what are our vulnerabilities going forward? And as you can see, the 100-year floodplain, which is shown in light blue on this chart, and that's the area where in any given year there's a 1% chance of flooding, that 100-year floodplain is quite extensive. If you look on this chart, what you see in blue here is that same 100-year floodplain from Sandy. And what you see in red is the area that was actually flooded during Sandy outside of the 100-year floodplain. Amazingly, over 1/3 of all of the red and yellow tagged buildings during Sandy were actually outside of that 100-year floodplain. Same is true with respect to nearly half of all impacted residential units. And the same is true with respect to over half of all of the impacted buildings. All of them were outside of that 100-year floodplain. Now, luckily, the city realized several years ago that these maps needed to be updated, and to its credit, FEMA did as well. What FEMA decided to do after the storm was to release a series of interim flood maps to give some guidance as to where their updating was likely to go. And then a couple of weeks ago, they yet again updated these interim flood maps. And you can see the interim flood maps here. And what you can see on this map is that these new interim flood maps have 100-year floodplains that are substantially more extensive than the 100-year floodplains in the 1983 maps. In fact, today, according to these interim maps, we have more built area in our 100-year floodplain than the city of Minneapolis has built area in total. But wait, because the story actually gets more depressing than that. The maps actually understate our risks yet again. And that's for two reasons. First of all, they're backwards looking. They look at past performance to try to make predictions about what the future is going to look like without necessarily accounting for whether that future, in fact, is going to look like the past. And they also only tell part of the story. They don't address a number of other threats that we face from climate change. They don't address future risks of downpours. As some of you remember, in 2007, there was a 3.5-inch rainstorm that nearly shut down the entire subway system. They don't address the future risks of heat waves, which each year kill more Americans than any other natural phenomenon. They don't address the future risks of drought. And perhaps most importantly, they don't address the future risks of sea level rise. Luckily, realizing this as part of Mayor Bloomberg's Plan YC, the mayor pulled together a group of academics from the academic institutions that you see listed on the screen who are leaders in the field of climate change and asked them to address this gap in information. And in 2009, they issued a groundbreaking report that for the first time contained peer-reviewed projections for how climate change would likely impact New York City across a range of hazards. And in 2013, as part of the mayor's special initiative, we reconvened the panel and asked them to update their work based on the best available science. First of all, when it comes to sea level rise, what the panel on climate change projects is that by mid-century, we are likely to see sea level rises of between 1 and 2 feet and possibly as much as 2.5 feet. And keep in mind, this is on top of a foot of sea level rise that has already occurred in the New York area since 1900. Meanwhile, when it comes to heat waves, something that is particularly timely today, whereas today, New York City experiences on average about 18 days a year of over 90-degree temperatures. By the middle of the century, the projections are that that number could nearly triple. And if that were to occur, we would have the same number of days above 90 degrees here in New York City as currently are experienced in Birmingham, Alabama, a very significant climactic shift. Using the information from the panel on climate change, we were then able to address some of the gaps in FEMA's flood maps. For example, creating what we described as future flood maps, which show what FEMA's flood maps may look like in the 2020s and the 2050s. On this map, what you'll see in blue is the area that is currently covered by the 100-year floodplain in the interim maps that FEMA recently released. The area in yellow or orange, depending on what the screen looks like, is the floodplain as we project it will look in the 2020s, and the area in red is the floodplain that we predict will be in effect by the 2050s. And as you can see, this is likely to expand the floodplain dramatically in certain parts of our city. For example, in East Harlem, along the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, especially in Long Island City, in southeastern Brooklyn, and in JFK Airport, which I'll just note, according to our projections, could be entirely within the 100-year floodplain by the 2050s. In fact, by the 2050s, the 100-year floodplain could encompass not the 530 million square feet of built area that it currently encompasses, but it could encompass a staggering 850 million square feet of built area in New York. Our modeling indicates that this could be the case for some 43 miles or 8% of our city's entire coastline, with much higher percentages experienced in boroughs like Brooklyn and Queens. And I think this begs an important question. What might the cost of all of this climate change be? And to answer this, we enlisted the help of Swiss Re, the giant reinsurer, who obviously pays very close attention to climate change because it could have a significant impact on their portfolio. And using the projections of the New York City panel on climate change, they concluded as follows. Whereas today, a storm that creates the magnitude of damage of Sandy, $19 billion or so here in New York City, is expected to occur roughly once in every 70 years. By the 2020s, that frequency could increase to once in every 60 years. And by the 2050s, that could increase to once in every 50 years. Now, that may not sound like a big and dramatic change to you, but let me just put that into a different frame. What that means is that by the 2050s, in any given year, there is a greater than 40%, there is a 40% higher likelihood that we will have a storm like Sandy in any given year than currently exists today. So what does all of this teach us? What it teaches us is that we've always known that we were vulnerable to coastal flooding. That's a fact that I think all of us as New Yorkers have been conscious of to one extent or another. But what we learned from FEMA and its new maps and from Hurricane Sandy is that, in fact, that vulnerability is greater than maybe we knew. What we learned from the New York City panel on climate change, meanwhile, is that that vulnerability is going to increase with time. And we also learned that that vulnerability involves more than just coastal storms. And what we finally have learned from Swiss Re is that there is a real cost to inaction. And as a result of all of this, we believe that our city has to start taking steps to address these long-term challenges, and we have to start taking them now. And that brings us to the third question that the mayor asked and our plan. As we pulled together our plan, we first settled on 4 core principles that guided us. At the mayor's direction, first of all, our goal was to be as ambitious as possible, but to make sure that whatever we developed was in fact achievable. As I like to say, we want to make sure that we're not aiming for the stars and then failing to get off the launching pad. Second, we have to acknowledge the fact that we live in a resource-limited time, but we also have to seek to stretch the resources that we have as far as we can. That means that we have to weigh all costs against their benefits. But here I think it's important to say that when we think about benefits, it's not just dollars and cents, although that's obviously an important part of our calculus. It's also thinking about protection of vulnerable populations, protection of vulnerable infrastructure, and other factors. Third, we believe that there is no single silver bullet that will protect us from everything, and that instead the right approach is a multi-layered approach. That means that we, of course, will protect our coastline, but we also have to think of what's behind our coastline. We have to think of our buildings. We have to think of the critical systems and infrastructure that support those buildings and the people who live and work in them. And finally, with respect to impacted areas of the city, the bottom line is that we believe that it is neither practical nor desirable for us to retreat from our coastline. Instead, we are committed to fighting for our coastal neighborhoods, and we are committed to rebuilding, and where possible, we are committed to improving these areas. Based on these principles, we developed a plan that was divided into 2 parts. The first part focuses on a series of critical citywide systems and infrastructure, from buildings to utilities to telecommunications to transportation and many more. The second part focuses on the areas of the city that suffered the greatest lingering physical damage within the 5 boroughs. But I do want to pick out some highlights. And where I'd like to start is with coastal protection. Here, we have a $3.7 billion first phase plan that will protect some of the city's most vulnerable areas through a combination of natural and man-made defenses that are shown here on the map. And in fact, this plan was mentioned by President Obama just yesterday or 2 days ago when he gave his address on climate change. We also have a plan, as you'll see here, eventually to protect the entirety of the city, the idea being that as we secure additional resources, we'll build out more of these defenses. Meanwhile, when it comes to our building stock, we have a 2-part plan. First, we're going to strengthen our building codes for new buildings to ensure greater wind resistance and greater resiliency with respect to flooding. And this is really the problem that we as a city face, with respect to the 68,000 buildings that today exist and are in our 100-year floodplain, we're going to create a $1.2 billion incentive program that will encourage owners to protect their key systems and, when it comes to the most vulnerable buildings in our city, to ensure structural integrity in the event of future events like Sandy. With respect to the National Flood Insurance Program, we're already working closely with FEMA to address two issues. One, to address some very serious affordability issues that actually have nothing to do with Sandy and are the result of reform legislation in Congress. We're calling on FEMA to put in place subsidy programs for the lowest income Americans and to provide premium credits for mitigation measures other than elevation, which is the preferred measure of mitigation in the FEMA flood insurance program, but a measure that is really impractical and in many cases infeasible in an urban environment like New York. Meanwhile, to increase uptake of flood insurance, we're also working with FEMA to create high deductible, low premium policies to encourage residential policyholders who aren't currently covered to ensure that they're not going to suffer a catastrophic loss in the event of a future Sandy. In our healthcare system, meanwhile, we're strengthening our building codes for new hospitals, new nursing homes, new adult care facilities that are built in vulnerable areas, and we're requiring retrofits of existing vulnerable facilities to protect their key systems. We're also launching a $50 million incentive program that will encourage nursing homes and adult care facilities to move forward with these retrofits as quickly as possible. And finally, when it comes to our utility system and our energy system, we're not only working with our utilities to encourage them to harden their existing infrastructure, which is something that is an obvious first step, but we're also working, and this is very important, with our utilities and our regulators to ensure that our regulations properly account for changes in climate change, while of course at the same time also working to reduce energy demand citywide and increase energy options for New York City consumers. And this is just the start. As you can see, our plan touches on a wide variety of other citywide systems and infrastructure. As I mentioned, another area on which our plan focuses is the communities that suffered the most lingering physical damage during Hurricane Sandy. And in these areas, we don't just apply the citywide remedies that I just discussed, but we also have developed a series of initiatives that are specially tailored to the very specific needs of these particular communities, focusing on areas like coastal protection, as well as infrastructure, and importantly, economic development. Among many other proposals in this area, we're calling for the creation of a 15 to 20 foot high armored dune that will run the length of the East Shore from Fort Wadsworth to Great Kills. This is a project for which I am proud to say we are about to secure $50 million in city capital funding in the budget that we hope the City Council will be passing shortly, and which could have dramatically changed the impact of Hurricane Sandy on some of the hardest hit neighborhoods in the city. In South Queens, in addition to coastal protection, which is obviously a very important part of our plan for this area, we're also focused on economic revitalization, concentrating particularly on the boardwalk, on sections of Far Rockaway, and as shown in the illustration below, along Beach 116th Street in Rockaway Park. In South Brooklyn, meanwhile, an illustrative initiative is a proposal that we have to create new wetlands and a tide gate along Coney Island Creek. Coney Island Creek, for those of you who don't know, was actually the source of much of the flooding, not just on the Coney Island Peninsula, but also in neighborhoods to the north like Gravesend. This plan would not only reduce the risk of that flooding, but could also create new opportunities for open space and could create new opportunities potentially for development in the future. And finally, there's this neighborhood, Southern Manhattan. Here, among our many proposals, is one that has received a fair amount of attention. It is a multi-purpose levee along the east side of Southern Manhattan that we call Seaport City. The levee would not only serve the purpose that Battery Park City served during Hurricane Sandy, that is to block floodwaters from the neighborhoods just inland of it, but it also could provide development paths for new commercial and residential buildings in including potentially for affordable housing. It could create new open space, and it might even generate surplus revenues, as Battery Park City does today, that would allow us not just to fund this project, but also to fund resiliency projects elsewhere in the city. Now, a good question for you to ask at this point might be, sounds like an ambitious plan, but how do you actually implement and pay for all of this? And I'm glad you asked that because I have an answer. The first point that I want to make is that this plan is largely funded. It is a $19.5 billion plan. And of this, about $10 billion is today in hand from a variety of sources, including capital, city capital, and federal money, with another $5 billion or so we think reasonably likely to be secured in the relatively near term, primarily from other federal sources. This obviously still leaves a gap of about $4.5 billion, but our plan contains detailed and concrete strategies for filling this gap. This includes up to $1 billion of additional city capital, and again, in the budget that is likely to be passed by the City Council shortly, we've secured about $250 million of that $1 billion already. And we also are looking at a variety of other potential sources, and I want to just flag one of them, which is Congress. And to understand why this is important, after Hurricane Katrina, Congress allocated a significant amount of money to the Gulf Coast for recovery. Then, several months later, Congress came back again and allocated another $9 billion to the Gulf Coast region for coastal defenses. There is no reason why New York City should not be treated similarly. The mayor recently appointed, when he unveiled this plan, the city's first director of resiliency, someone named Dan Zarilli, who actually was the mastermind behind our coastal defense plan. And we're looking to put into city law, as we did after Plan YC, not just this structure, but also an obligation for the mayor's office on a regular basis to update and to deliver reports on progress according to this plan. So to conclude, I'd like to just show one last chart. And as you'll see on this chart, between 1900 and 2011, that's 111 years, sea levels in the New York area rose 13.4 inches. Based on the work that was done for us by the New York City Panel on Climate Change, the high end of sea level rise estimates for the area project an increase of another 9.5 inches between 2011 and the 2020s, with yet another 20 inches on top of that foreseen between the 2020s and the 2050s, or a total of nearly 30 inches of sea level rise. That means that at these rates, in the next 4.5 years, we could witness over 20% of the total sea level rise that occurred during the 111 years between 1900 and 2011. Earlier this month, the mayor offered a plan that meets these requirements. I don't think it's unfair to say that we deserve to know whether the mayor's successor will carry that plan forward, or if not, what his or her alternative might be. I think the New York Times editorial page this weekend had it right when they said, in an era of rising seawater, temperature extremes, and superstorms, the next mayor has a duty to manage the growing risk of natural disaster.
And have a good time and enjoy what we all have done down here. So thank you and have a great holiday.